December 1945. Hamburg detention camp. 47 women wearing tattered Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms stood in formation, waiting for their death sentences. They had heard the news from Nuremberg: female guards hanged, collaborators executed, the Soviet camps worse than death itself. These women expected nothing less. But what came next would defy everything they thought they knew about justice, mercy, and their own futures. Her name was Helga Hoffmann, 24 years old, radar operator for the Luftwaffe. For 3 years, she had tracked Allied bombers crossing into German airspace, feeding coordinates to anti-aircraft batteries. Next to her stood Liesel Braun, 19, a military nurse who had treated wounded German soldiers in field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Margarete Schmidt, known as Magda, stood at the back. 31 years old, mother of 2 boys who had disappeared during the bombing camp. She had served as a military telegraphist. Her husband had died at Stalingrad in 1943. More than 500,000 German women had served in auxiliary military roles during the war. They were not combat soldiers, but they wore uniforms, followed military discipline, and performed duties essential to the German war machine. They operated radios and radar systems, served as anti-aircraft auxiliaries, worked as nurses in military hospitals. They were called Helferinnen, helpers. The Nazis had mobilized them because Germany was running out of men. Now approximately 15,000 of these women had been captured by Allied forces. The vast majority fell into Soviet hands and faced Soviet labor camps in Siberia. Those captured by British and American forces hoped for better treatment, but after the Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, even that hope seemed fragile. Irma Grius, a guard at Bergen-Belsen, was hanged on December 13th. She was 22 years old. The message was clear: wearing a uniform would not save you. January 1946. A British officer entered the detention camp and called the 47 women into assembly. Major William Thompson carried a folder of documents and an expression that revealed nothing. What he announced was so unexpected that several women thought they had misheard. Not execution, not transfer to Soviet custody. Instead, transfer to Canada as part of an experimental labor resettlement program. The women would work on Canadian farms and in Canadian hospitals for a mandatory 2-year period under supervision. After that, their status would be. Thompson explained that Canada faced a critical labor shortage. More than 1 million Canadian men had served overseas, and although they were returning home, the agricultural and healthcare sectors desperately needed workers. The Canadian government had agreed to accept a small number of German prisoners for labor purposes. This was not charity. The women would work hard. They would be supervised. They would be prohibited from speaking German in public. Any violation would result in deportation to Soviet custody, but they would not be executed. They would have a chance at a future. The German POW labor scheme was a real program that brought German prisoners to Canada between 1945 and 1947. Most were men assigned to agricultural work in the prairie provinces, where labor shortages were most acute. The program was pragmatic, not humanitarian. Canada needed workers. Germany had prisoners. The arrangement benefited both sides. In February 1946, the 47 women boarded the HMS Victorious, a troop transport ship bound for Halifax. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. The women were housed in converted cargo holds, sleeping in hammocks. The North Atlantic in February is brutal, with waves reaching 30 feet. Most had never been on a ship before. Seasickness became epidemic within hours. The Canadian soldiers aboard viewed the German women with open hostility. These men had fought at Dieppe in August 1942, where Canadian forces suffered catastrophic casualties. They had stormed Juno Beach on D-Day. They had liberated the Netherlands. Now they shared a ship with German women who had served the military that killed their friends. There were no incidents of violence, but the tension was constant. The ship arrived at Halifax on February 23rd. The temperature was 18 degrees below 0 Celsius. Snow covered everything. The women were processed through Pier 21, photographed, fingerprinted, and made to sign documents pledging to fulfill their work obligations. Then they were separated. 20 women went to farms in Saskatchewan and Alberta. 15 went to hospitals in Ontario. 12 went to various domestic positions. Helga was sent to a farm outside Lethbridge, Alberta. Liesel went to a hospital in Kingston, Ontario. Magda went to a communications center in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Helga's train journey from Halifax to Lethbridge took 4 days. Through the window she watched endless variations of white and gray. Forests gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to prairie that stretched forever. The farm belonged to the McLeod family. Duncan McLeod was 58. His wife Margaret was 55. Their eldest son Robert had died at Juno Beach. He was 23 years old. Their younger son Andrew had returned from the war, but moved to Calgary, unable to work due to injuries. Their daughter had married and moved to Vancouver. Duncan and Margaret were alone on 600 acres that required 4 people to operate. When Helga arrived in early March, Margaret McLeod opened the door and stared at her for a long moment without speaking. Helga stood carrying a single cloth bag containing everything she owned. She managed to say in broken English that she was assigned to work there. Margaret stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The house was warm, heated by a wood stove. Helga had not felt genuinely warm in months. Margaret showed her to a small room on the second floor. This was Robert's room, she said quietly. The work began the next morning at 6. Duncan explained Helga's duties through gestures and simple words. She would help with livestock, feeding cattle, collecting eggs, milking cows. She would assist with equipment maintenance. When spring planting began in April, she would work in the fields. The days would be long, typically 12 hours, sometimes longer during planting and harvest. Sundays she could rest. The work was physically brutal. Helga had operated radar equipment during the war, work requiring technical skill but little physical strength. Now she hauled 40-pound feed sacks, shoveled manure in freezing temperatures, learned to milk cows. Her fingers cramped, and her back ached constantly. But alongside the difficulty came something she had not experienced in years: abundance. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, toast, butter, and milk. Lunch was sandwiches with meat and cheese. Dinner was roasted chicken or beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, sometimes pie. In 1945, German civilians in cities were receiving between 1,000 and 1,500 calories per day, often less. At the McLeod farm, each meal is easily exceeded 1,000 calories. The first week, Helga ate until she was uncomfortably full at every meal, unable to trust that the next meal would come. Her stomach, shrunken from years of inadequate food, cramped and rebelled. Margaret McLeod watched this but said nothing. Liesel's experience in Kingston was different but parallel. The hospital was chronically understaffed since many Canadian nurses had married and left the workforce. Liesel was assigned to the surgical recovery ward under head nurse Catherine Morrison, 45 years old, who had lost her brother in Italy in 1944. Catherine made her position clear on the first day. She had not wanted a German nurse, but they were short-staffed and patients needed care. Liesel would work, follow instructions exactly, and not speak German anywhere in the building. If she performed adequately, there would be no problems. The nursing work was familiar. Liesel had spent 2 years in field hospitals on the Eastern Front treating wounds, ranging from simple lacerations to catastrophic trauma. She had performed emergency amputations, managed morphine supplies, worked under bombardment. Civilian hospital in peaceful Canada should have been easy. But the psychological burden was different. Now she treated Canadian veterans with ongoing injuries from the war. She changed bandages on a man who had lost his legs in France. She monitored recovery of a soldier burned when his tank caught fire in Germany. These men had fought against her country. Some refused her care outright, demanding a Canadian nurse instead. Magda's assignment in Winnipeg was perhaps the strangest. She worked at a military communications center translating German documents and decoding German communications still being intercepted from occupied Germany. The irony was stark. She had spent the war encoding German military communications. Now she decoded them for the Canadian military. In March 1946, Magda submitted a request through the Red Cross for information about her sons, last known to be in Dresden. The response came in April. No records found. It meant nothing, essentially. The winter of 1946 gave way to spring. On the McLeod farm, preparations for spring planting began in early April. Seeding 600 acres of wheat and barley required enormous effort in a compressed time frame. Duncan McLeod taught Helga to operate a tractor, a 1938 John Deere Model B. She learned to drive in straight lines across the field while seeding equipment distributed grain into the soil. She worked from dawn until dusk. By mid-May, the planting was complete. Helga had proven herself capable, and Duncan's attitude shifted from cold supervision to grudging respect. He began explaining tasks instead of merely demonstrating them. Once, when the tractor broke down, he worked alongside her for 3 hours to repair it, speaking more that afternoon than in the previous 2 months. She was no longer the German girl. She was becoming the hired hand. Margaret's thaw was slower, but small gestures appeared. Extra biscuits at breakfast. A heavier coat left by the door, a bottle of liniment placed on her dresser without comment. In Kingston, Liesel's competence was earning similar acceptance. She worked double shifts when nurses called in sick. She volunteered for the least desirable duties. By summer 1946, Catherine Morrison was given her more responsibility, allowing her to assist in surgery. The breakthrough moment came in July. A farming accident resulted in Thomas Bradley being rushed to the hospital with severe arterial bleeding in his left leg. The on-call surgeon was delayed. Bradley, 38 and father of 4, was bleeding out. Catherine made the decision: stabilize him until the surgeon arrived. Liesel's field hospital experience took over. She applied a tourniquet high on the thigh, started an intravenous line for fluid replacement, monitored his vital signs. When Bradley's blood pressure dropped dangerously low, indicating shock, Liesel elevated his legs and increased the fluid rate without waiting for instructions. The surgeon arrived 20 minutes later. The operation was successful. Bradley survived, though he lost most function in his left leg. The Bradley family came to thank the staff the next day. Eleanor Bradley asked to speak to the nurses who had saved her husband's life. Catherine brought Liesel into the room. Eleanor looked at Liesel's young face and said, "Thank you for saving my husband." Then she embraced her. The story spread through Kingston. The German nurse who saved Tom Bradley. Within weeks, patients who had refused Liesel's care began accepting it. The hostile unanimity had broken. For Magda, change came through different channels. In August 1946, a large group of German war brides arrived in Canada. These were German women who had married Canadian soldiers during the occupation and were now immigrating to join their husbands. Many spoke no English. Most had never been outside Germany. The Canadian Immigration Services desperately needed translators. Magda was reassigned from military communications to immigration assistance. She spent her days helping German women navigate Canadian bureaucracy, translating documents, explaining procedures. One woman, Anna Weber, 23 and pregnant, arrived to discover her husband had been killed in a construction accident 2 weeks earlier. She was alone with no money, no family, no ability to communicate. Magda spent a week helping Anna file for benefits, find housing, connect with a German-speaking church community. When Anna broke down crying, Magda held her and let her sob in German, the first time either woman had expressed grief in their native language in months. By late 1946, the 47 women scattered across Canada had survived their first year. None had been executed, none had been sent to Soviet camps. But survival was different from living. They had expected death and found labor. Now they were beginning to discover something more complex: the possibility of futures. The spring of 1947 brought a geopolitical shift that would profoundly affect the women's status. The wartime alliance between Western powers and the Soviet Union was collapsing. Communist governments were being installed across Eastern Europe. In Germany, the division between Soviet and Western occupation zones was hardening. The Cold War was beginning. This transformed how Canadians viewed Germans. During the war, Germans were the enemy. Now West Germany was being positioned as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Former enemies were becoming potential allies. In Lethbridge, this manifested unexpectedly. The local school district was struggling to offer German language classes. Before the war, German had been commonly taught in prairie schools with significant German immigrant populations. But during the war, German language instruction had been suspended as unpatriotic. Now educational authorities wanted to restore language programs but had no German teachers. Someone remembered the McLeod farm had a German worker. In March 1947, a school district official visited and asked if Helga would teach German language classes at the local high school. 2 evenings per week, paid position. Helga was stunned. For a year she had been forbidden from speaking German in public. Now she was being asked to teach it. Duncan MacLeod supported the request. The British authorities approved it. In April, Helga Hoffman began teaching German to Canadian high school students. The psychological shift was profound. For a year, she had been the German worker, defined entirely by her former enemy status. Now she was the German teacher, someone with valuable knowledge. The students treated her with casual teenage respect, sometimes attentive, sometimes distracted, but never hostile. To them, she was not a former Nazi auxiliary. She was the person who graded their homework. The community's response was mixed. Some parents objected. Letters were written to the school board, but other parents supported it, arguing that German language skills were valuable and Helga had proven herself through hard work. The decision stood. In Kingston, Liesel's life was transforming differently. Among the patients she had cared for was James Morrison, 32 years old, who had lost his left leg below the knee during the Battle of the Scheldt in October 1944. He had been in and out of the hospital for 18 months, dealing with complications. Liesl had been his nurse during several stays. James was Catherine Morrison's nephew. Catherine had mentioned once that James struggled with depression, common among amputee veterans. During one hospital stay in May 1947, Liesl found James sitting alone staring out the window. She sat down and began talking about treating German soldiers who had lost limbs in field hospitals, about how they struggled with the same depression and anger. She told him about one soldier who had lost both legs and refused to eat, refused physical therapy, refused to live. James asked what happened. Liesl said she did not know. He was transferred when her unit retreated, but she remembered something he told her. His injury hurt less when he stopped thinking of it as something stolen and started thinking of it as the price he paid to stay alive. James thought about this. Then he said, "You saved Tom Bradley's life last year. Everyone heard about that. My Aunt Catherine says you're maybe the best nurse she's worked with. I've spent a year and a half hating that I survived when so many friends didn't. Maybe I've been thinking about it wrong. Maybe survival is worth a leg." It was not a dramatic revelation, not sudden healing, but it was a shift. Over the following months, James returned for routine checkups and always asked if Liesl was working. They began talking regularly, conversations that started with medical topics and gradually expanded. James talked about his family's farm, his plans to return to forestry work using adapted equipment. Liesl talked about her nursing training in Germany, carefully avoiding details of wartime service. In October 1947, James asked if Liesl would have dinner with him outside the hospital. She needed permission for activities outside work duties. Catherine Morrison, when asked, gave approval. The dinner was quiet and awkward, two people from enemy nations attempting to build something personal, but it was a beginning. In Winnipeg, Magda's transformation was professional rather than romantic. Her work helping German immigrants had revealed a significant gap in Canadian immigration services. Thousands of German refugees and war brides were arriving with no support system, no language assistance, no cultural orientation. Magda wrote a report documenting these problems and submitted it through official channels. To her surprise, it reached someone who cared. In November 1947, a senior immigration official visited Winnipeg to interview her. He wanted to understand the scope of the problem. Magda explained what German immigrants needed. The official asked if she would help design such a program. She said yes. But then came the letter that changed everything. December 1947. Red Cross notification. After 18 months of searching, they had found information about Magda's sons. Both had been in Dresden on February 13, 1945, when Allied bombers attacked the city. The firestorm killed approximately 25,000 people. Magda's sons were confirmed among the dead. Bodies had been identified through records from the shelter where they had been staying. Magda read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her desk drawer, and went to the bathroom, where she locked the door and wept silently for 20 minutes. When she emerged, her face was composed. She returned to her desk and continued working. That night, alone in her room, she faced the question that had been hovering unasked for 2 years. What was she returning to Germany for? Her sons were dead. Her husband was dead. Her parents had died before the war. Her siblings were scattered across occupied Germany, if they were alive at all. Her home city was destroyed. She had spent 2 years waiting to return to a country that no longer existed, to a life that had been obliterated. The realization was crushing. She had nothing to return to. Germany was a graveyard. Eleanor Wright, Magda's supervisor, found her sitting at her desk at 7 in the evening, long after work hours, staring at nothing. Eleanor sat down without asking questions and waited. After several minutes, Magda said very quietly, "My children are dead." Eleanor, who had lost her own husband in the war, reached across the desk and took Magda's hand. They sat like that in silence until the night janitor gently suggested they go home. The winter of 1947-48 was harsh across Canada, but it was also when the women's status began to change fundamentally. On May 1, 1947, the Canadian government had passed a new Immigration Act opening Canada to larger numbers of European refugees, prioritizing skilled workers. Crucially, the act provided pathways to permanent residency for people who had entered under temporary work programs, including former POWs. In January 1948, British authorities began reviewing cases of German POW laborers whose 2-year mandatory work periods were ending. Those who had fulfilled their obligations, demonstrated good conduct, and had employment prospects could apply for Canadian landed immigrant status. Those who had violated terms would be deported. Most would be given the choice: return to Germany or apply to stay in Canada. But what future did Germany offer? The country remained divided into occupation zones. The economy was collapsed. Currency was worthless. Food was still rationed. 7 million Germans were homeless. Cities remained largely destroyed 3 years after the war. Housing was so scarce that families of 6 lived in single rooms. Infrastructure was shattered. Unemployment was massive. Political uncertainty was total. This was what awaited women who chose to return. In contrast, Canada offered stability. The economy was booming. Food was abundant. Jobs were plentiful. The country was peaceful, untouched by the destruction that had ravaged Europe. In March 1948, British authorities organized a gathering of the 47 women at a processing center in Toronto. This was the first time they had all been together since leaving Hamburg 2 years earlier. The reunion was emotional. Women who had survived the war together, then survived 2 years of hard labor in a foreign country, embraced and wept and shared stories. They spoke German freely for the first time in months. Then came the formal briefing. A British officer explained their mandatory work terms were ending. Each woman would be interviewed individually to assess her conduct and determine her options. Those eligible could apply for Canadian landed immigrant status. Those who chose to return to Germany would be transported to Hamburg. Everyone would leave Canada either as an immigrant or a deportee. The women spent that evening debating. Opinions divided sharply. Some felt a powerful pull to return despite the hardships. They had families there, parents or siblings. They were German, and Germany was where they belonged. One woman said, "I cannot abandon my mother. She is 67 and alone. I must go back." But other women saw it differently. What was Germany now? A destroyed country divided among foreign occupiers. A place where being a former Nazi auxiliary could still result in prosecution. One woman said, "Germany needs to forget the war. How can it forget if we go back? We are reminders of everything that needs to be buried." Helga spoke about teaching German classes. "For a year I could not speak my language in public. Now I teach it to Canadian students. They do not hate me. They do not see me as a Nazi. They see me as a teacher who knows German. Is that not better than returning to a country where everyone sees only the uniform I wore?" Liesl talked about James Morrison. "He lost his leg fighting against Germany. I treated German soldiers fighting against Canada. Now we are building something together. How is that possible if we are still enemies?" Magda was quiet for most of the evening. When asked her opinion, she said simply, "My children are buried in Germany, but my future cannot be." Several women nodded. The past was in Germany, but for many of them the past was death and destruction and loss. The future, uncertain as it was, existed in Canada. Not everyone agreed. 6 women were determined to return. 3 had parents still alive and dependent on them. 1 had a husband who had survived Soviet captivity and was waiting in Hamburg. 2 could not imagine living permanently in a foreign country. The individual interviews took place over 3 days. For most women, the interviews were straightforward. They had worked diligently for 2 years. Their supervisors provided positive references. They had no criminal activity. They were approved for landed immigrant status if they chose to apply. Hilda's interview lasted 15 minutes. Duncan MacLeod had provided a reference describing her as reliable, hardworking, and trustworthy. The school district supported her application. The official asked if she wanted to remain in Canada. She said yes. Application approved. Liesl's interview addressed her relationship with James Morrison. Were they planning to marry? Liesl answered honestly. They were in a relationship, but had not yet discussed marriage formally. The officials approved her application regardless. Her work record was exemplary. Magda's interview was longest. Her work in immigration services had given her insights into the system. She explained her idea for a comprehensive support program for German immigrants. The officials were interested. Canada was accepting thousands of European refugees and desperately needed people with language skills and cultural knowledge. Would she work in this capacity permanently? She said yes. Application approved and offered a full-time position. By April 1948, decisions were finalized. 41 women applied for landed immigrant status. All 41 were approved. 6 women requested repatriation to Germany. In May, those 6 boarded a transport ship in Halifax bound for Hamburg. The 41 who stayed watched them depart. The farewell was emotional. Women who had survived so much together were separating permanently. Addresses were exchanged. Promises to write were made. The 6 who returned faced mixed outcomes. 1 reunited with her husband and rebuilt her life in Hamburg. 2 found their parents alive and settled into difficult existences in the British occupation zone. 1 was arrested by Soviet authorities after crossing into the Soviet zone searching for family and spent 5 years in a labor camp. 2 disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany, their fates unknown. The 41 who stayed faced their own challenges. Landed immigrant status was not citizenship. They were legal residents permitted to live and work permanently, but they remained German nationals. They could not vote or hold government positions. They needed to maintain clean records and demonstrate continuous employment. After 5 years, they could apply for Canadian citizenship, but they were no longer prisoners. They were immigrants. Helga continued teaching German and working on the MacLeod farm. By 1950, the Mickleds were treating her as family, inviting her to holiday meals, including her in family photographs. When Duncan's health began declining in 1951, Helga took over much of the farm management. In 1952, she met Robert Chun, a Chinese-Canadian engineer working on irrigation projects in southern Alberta. Robert's family had immigrated in the 1890s and faced decades of discrimination. He understood what it meant to be viewed as perpetually foreign. They bonded over the shared experience of being outsiders. They married in 1953. The marriage was controversial. A former German Nazi auxiliary marrying a Chinese Canadian challenged multiple social boundaries. Some people refused to attend. The local newspaper questioned whether such marriages were appropriate, but Duncan and Margaret MacLeod attended and hosted the reception at their farm. The Mickleds' endorsement carried weight. Gradually, the controversy faded. Liesl and James Morrison married in June 1949. Catherine Morrison, who had been Liesl's stern supervisor and was now her aunt by marriage, helped plan the wedding. The ceremony was small, held in a united church with 30 guests. Several of James's veteran friends attended, men who had fought in Europe. Seeing James marry the German nurse who had helped him recover sent a powerful message. The war was truly over. Lisa left hospital nursing after her first child was born in 1950. She and James had 4 children by 1957. She worked part-time as a visiting nurse providing home health care to elderly and disabled patients in rural areas. By the early 1960s, she was training other nurses in trauma care, sharing knowledge gained in German field hospitals to improve Canadian civilian medicine. Magda became a Canadian citizen in 1952, one of the first from the group to achieve that status. Her work in immigration services expanded steadily. She helped design orientation programs for European refugees, trained other translators, and eventually became a senior administrator. She never remarried. When asked why, she said simply that her heart had been buried with her husband at Stalingrad and her sons in Dresden, but she threw herself into helping other refugees rebuild their lives. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had completely transformed how Canadians viewed Germans. West Germany was now a crucial NATO ally. The Federal Republic of Germany was established in May 1949 as a democratic state aligned with Western powers. Canadian troops were stationed in West Germany as part of NATO forces. The Soviet Union, which had been Canada's ally during World War II, was now the primary threat. Former enemies had become friends. This made life easier for German immigrants in Canada. Anti-German prejudice declined sharply by the mid-1950s. Being German-Canadian was simply one ethnicity among many in Canada's increasingly multicultural society. In 1956, 10 years after arriving, several women traveled back to Germany to visit. They found a country transformed, but still scarred. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was underway. Currency reform in 1948 had stabilized the economy. Marshall Plan aid had funded reconstruction. Cities were being rebuilt. But the division between East and West Germany was now permanent. Families separated by the Iron Curtain could not reunite. The psychological burden of Nazi crimes hung over everything. Helga visited Hamburg, the city where she had waited for execution in December 1945. The detention camp was gone, converted to civilian housing. She met with 2 of the 6 women who had returned. Both expressed envy of her life in Canada. Both asked if it was too late to immigrate. Helga explained the process and encouraged them to try. One eventually succeeded. The other could not leave her elderly mother. When Helga returned to Canada, Robert asked if she regretted staying. Helga thought carefully before answering. Germany is where I was born. Canada is where I became who I am. I am German, but I am also Canadian. I do not have to choose anymore. This dual identity became common among the women. They maintained German cultural practices, language, and traditions while fully participating in Canadian society. In the 1960s, as their children grew up, the women faced complex questions about identity and heritage. When Liesl's eldest son was 12, he asked if she had fought in the war. Liesl said no, she had been a nurse. He asked if she had helped the Nazis. Liesl struggled to answer. Finally she said, I helped wounded soldiers. Many of them had done terrible things. I did not ask what they had done. I just tried to keep them alive. Was that wrong? Her son asked. Do you think you did the right thing? Liesl said. I think I did what I was trained to do. Whether it was right or wrong, I cannot say. The war made everything complicated. I try not to judge my younger self too harshly. Magda, who had no children of her own, became a mentor to younger German immigrants throughout the 1950s and 60s. She helped them navigate Canadian schools, learn English, and maintain connections to German culture. She organized German-language social groups, cultural events, and support networks. She became a central figure in Winnipeg's German-Canadian community. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, a Canadian journalist interviewed several of the women. The journalist asked Helga what she remembered most about arriving. Helga said, "The cold. I had never been so cold. But also the food. We had not eaten properly in years. That first meal, I could not believe there was so much food. I ate until I was sick." The journalist asked if she had expected to stay. Helga laughed. "I expected to be executed. Everything that came after was unexpected." The journalist asked Liesl what it was like treating Canadian veterans. Liesl was silent for a long moment. It was hard. Some hated me. Some did not care. Some were grateful for good care regardless of who provided it. I learned that people are complicated. War makes us see each other as enemies. But peace reveals we are all just people trying to survive. The journalist asked if she considered herself German or Canadian. Liesl said both, and neither. I am something in between. The journalist asked Magda if she regretted leaving Germany. I did not leave Germany. Germany was destroyed. The country I grew up in no longer exists. I came to Canada and built a new life. But I carried Germany with me always. In my language, my memories, my grief. My sons are buried there. Part of me will always be there with them. The journalist asked what she had gained. The chance to help people, the chance to be useful, the chance to build something instead of only mourning what was lost. By the 1970s, most of the 41 women had become Canadian citizens. They had children who were Canadian by birth. Some had grandchildren. They had built lives, careers, families, and communities. They had integrated while maintaining connections to German culture. They represented a particular kind of immigrant experience. People who arrived as enemies, worked as prisoners, and stayed as citizens. The story of these women is not widely known. There are no monuments to them. Most Canadians are unaware that German POW women were ever brought to Canada. The women themselves often did not share their full stories, even with their own families. The shame and complexity of having served Nazi Germany made the past difficult to discuss. It was easier to focus on building Canadian futures than explaining German pasts, but their impact was real. They filled critical labor shortages during a crucial period of Canadian development. They brought skills that benefited Canadian agriculture, healthcare, and immigration services. They raised Canadian children and contributed to Canadian communities. They demonstrated that former enemies could become good citizens, that people are not permanently defined by their worst national moment, that integration is possible even across deep divides. What makes their story unique is the specific historical moment. They were not refugees fleeing persecution. They were former members of a military that had been decisively defeated. They arrived expecting punishment and found opportunity. They were given a chance to rebuild their lives in a country that had fought against theirs, a chance most people in their situation never received. That they succeeded, that they integrated, that they built meaningful lives, says something important about both the women and Canada. In 1987, a filmmaker making a documentary about Canadian immigration tracked down several surviving women. By then they were in their 60s and 70s, grandmothers with thick Canadian accents. The filmmaker asked Helga, then 66, if she had ever regretted staying. Helga thought for a moment and then said something that perfectly captured the paradox of her life. We came as prisoners. We stayed as Canadians, and we never wanted to leave. I do not know if we deserved the chance we were given. I do not know if Canada should have accepted us, but I know we took that chance seriously. We worked, we integrated, we built lives, we raised children who are Canadian. I think we earned the right to stay, but I will always be grateful it was offered. Then she paused and added, we expected execution. Instead we found home. How many people can say that? That gratitude, complex and conditional, marked by awareness of privilege and historical accident, defined the women's relationship to Canada. They never forgot where they came from or what they had expected. The shadow of potential execution, of Soviet labor camps, of destroyed Germany, always lingered. They knew how easily their stories could have ended differently. that knowledge made them appreciate what they had built in Canada, even as they carried permanent grief for what they had lost in Germany. What they proved is that people are more than their worst moments, that enemies can become neighbors, that integration across deep divides is possible, but never easy. They demonstrated that second chances, when offered and accepted seriously, can transform lives. They showed that history's judgments are not final, that individuals can transcend collective guilt, that futures can be built even after everything seems lost. They expected execution. Instead, they found a country they never wanted to leave. And in building their unexpected lives, they became part of Canada's own complex story of immigration, integration, and possibility.